Katie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Sherry.
Do you want to call Paul, or are they coming on?
I'll give them a call.
His number is 202.
Yep, I have it, Sherry. No worries. They're
Okay.
calling me right now.
All
And
right.
for those of us guests who are just waiting to come on, we will begin the program in just 1 minute. We're dealing with a little bit of technical difficulties today, but thank you for your patience.
Hey, yeah. Hi there. We're back.
Sherry, whenever you're ready, please feel free.
All right. Warm greetings, everyone, from Indian Wells, California, and I do mean warm. My name is Sherry Mueller, and it is my privilege to serve as president of the Public Diplomacy Council. It is also my privilege to welcome each and every one of you to this webinar. We have more than 150 registrants from the Netherlands to San Francisco, and we're looking forward to a very special program, a First Monday Forum featuring Paul Richter and Karen Tumulty. There are three co-sponsors of First Monday Forums: the Public Diplomacy Association of America, the Public Diplomacy Council, and the USC, University of Southern California, Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy. This is the first Monday Forum we've had since Labor Day weekend, and it brings to mind a favorite quote of mine. Teddy Roosevelt, in a 1903 Labor Day speech, said, "Far and away the best prize life offers is the chance to work hard at work worth doing." Many of you know we lost a giant in our field when Tom Tuck passed away last week. And I know he embraced the idea that public diplomacy is work worth doing. So we dedicate this First Monday Forum to his memory and his impressive legacy. I'm going to turn the microphone over to our technical host, Katie Conti. She was a volunteer, rising professional member of the Public Diplomacy Council. And when she's not volunteering to help us on with First Monday Forum, she's working at Meridian International Center. So I'm grateful to you, Katie. Following Katie, the program will be moderated and orchestrated by Joel Fischman, who's president of the Public Diplomacy Association of America. So thanks to you all. Katie, please share some technical details.
Good morning or good afternoon. Again, my name is Katie Conti. I'm here and very happy to help with any tech needs that may arise. So I did want to introduce just a couple of Zoom webinar features, as that's the platform that we'll be using for today's program. As you may have seen, some of your fellow attendees have begun to introduce themselves in the chat box, which can be located on the bottom right of your screen. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in there, speak to any organizational affiliations that you have, and also I will be monitoring this box throughout the program for any technical difficulties that I might be able to help you with. Following remarks by both Paul and Karen, moderated by Joel, there will be time for audience question and answer. So please, throughout the program, add your questions into the Q&A box, which can be found in the bottom center of your screen. So this is slightly confusing as we do have two different mechanisms for chatting, but please make sure to use the chat box for introducing yourself and voicing technical issues, and the question and answer box for commenting, asking your questions, and I will gladly help field those following remarks. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Joel, who will introduce our wonderful speakers.
Hello, everyone. How good it is to see so many people today. Credit for this program goes to Joan Mower, PDAA Vice President and Program Chair. Unfortunately, Joan cannot be with us today, so I asked her how she would introduce Paul Richter and Karen Tumulty if she were here. So here goes. Paul Richter and Karen Tumulty, a husband-wife team, have been some of the best-known journalists in Washington for decades. Between them, they've covered a variety of beats and won numerous awards. We are delighted they've agreed to join us today. Paul, a native of Minneapolis and a graduate of Clark University, spent most of his career with the Los Angeles Times in New York and Washington, where he covered the State Department, among other things. He left in 2015 to write books, one of which he'll be discussing today, The Ambassadors, America's Diplomats on the Front Lines. This is a fascinating portrait of the work of four people, many of whom people in this Zoom room know personally. Karen, a Texas native and graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and Harvard Business School, is a political columnist for the Washington Post, which she joined in 2010. Previously, she worked for Time magazine and, like Paul, the Los Angeles Times. Karen is also an author. We're looking forward to reading The Triumph of Nancy Reagan, which will be published on April 13. I hope I have the date right. 2021, of course. Paul and Karen will start with comments about the treatment of foreign policy during the campaign, how the US and foreign media are handling it, and we'll take it from there. So, Paul and Karen, we're delighted to have you. And we turn the floor, so to speak, over to you.
Great. Here we go. Oops, I'm unmuting. Sorry about this. Paul?
It's great to be with you today. Foreign policy isn't going to be the dominant theme in the campaign, as you're all noticing. The big issues are going to be domestic, COVID, the economy, racial justice issues. But foreign policy will have its place in there. President Trump has decided that he's going to roll out a number of announcements between now and Election Day He's going to announce the drawdown of troops in Afghanistan, which he's already announced. He's going to announce a drawdown of troops in Germany as well. And he's announced agreements between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, all to show his accomplishments, the accomplishments he wants to showcase from his term. I don't think there's going to be a serious discussion of the really heavyweight and important issues of foreign policy, a nuanced discussion that will take in such topics as what the U.S. role in the Middle East should be. It'll be more focused, and the press is already doing this, it'll be more focused on President Trump's record on foreign policy and kind of the allegations about his performance. Things like the issue of the Russians allegedly paying bounties for U.S. troops in Afghanistan, Trump's treatment of the military, Trump's close relationship with foreign authoritarian leaders, starting with Vladimir Putin. The foreign press is keenly interested in this subject. There are some European papers that are running front page stories 3 times a week about the American election. Trump has always fascinated them, and foreign correspondents in the U.S. Love to write about the colorful and eccentric ways of this country and its leaders, and they're having a good time with this election. The Economist sent out a reporter to Ohio the other day and found some young tradesmen who were Trump fans and are convinced that the president has reduced the U.S. debt. He's created a new national health care system, and he's gotten the Mexicans to pay for the wall with Mexico. So we're going to see a lot more coverage like this, and coverage about the personality of the president between now and Election Day. The Guardian is so proud of its coverage of the election that they're using it to promote their product and try to build circulation during this period.
Yeah, I really do think that foreign policy as policy has gotten so little attention in this campaign season, and particularly because Donald Trump seems to define foreign policy not as policies, but as transactions. And so he is boasting of his relationships with specific world leaders and seems to have a affinity for authoritarians. And the other thing that I think that is now seeping into the campaign is the degree to which members of the president's national security and foreign policy teams have really emerged as, former members, that is, have emerged as really some of his chief critics. And I do wonder if that is going to, between now and November, sort of seep into the dialogue a little more, and whether if there's going to be an October surprise, it is likely to be something foreign policy related. We seem to be having a problem. You want to call them and see if something's wrong here?
Yeah.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great.
We can hear you. We can hear you fine. Go ahead.
Oh, did you not hear everything we just said?
We did.
You did. Okay, great.
We did.
Here, are we moving on to the second question?
Let's move on to how press coverage. You've handled press coverage of the State Department. How has it changed since you were covering the building in the Bush and Obama years? I
think coverage of the State Department beat is is less important and probably a lot less fun than it was in the years when I was covering it, which is when George W. Bush was president and when Obama was president. In those days, the State Department leadership had a much more important role in dictating. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. In dictating policy now, a lot more of the policy is guided by what President Trump does and thinks, what those right around him have in mind. And so Secretary Pompeo and the people around him and the career professionals are simply a lot less in the news. In the years when I was there, the secretaries of state and were really eager to have the mainstream press accept their views, and they gave a lot of access and spent a lot of time briefing the press on what they planned, even in periods when, during the Iraq War, when much of the country was against what the administration was doing. Officials at the State Department wanted to make their case. Now, the administration at the State Department is less interested in the mainstream media and in winning the support of the entire country. They're more focused on the conservative end of the Republican spectrum. And so the mainstream media are less important to them and they give less access. I think Secretary Pompeo seems to be aiming in part in building his political reputation among parts of the conservative end of the spectrum as well. And there's really no downside for Pompeo in picking fights with the press. It's actually probably works well for him with the base and with the president as well. So now reporters on the beat are spending a lot of time writing about the troubles of the department, the hollowing of the diplomatic corps, and various allegations about Secretary Pompeo's behavior. But those subjects don't get the play. They're not as important as what was going on during the Bush and Obama administrations. And so it's just a lot harder for reporters on the State Department beat now to get front page stories.
And from a sort of, and again, my domestic political reporter hat here, another sort of fascinating dynamic, I think, is that Secretary Pompeo does seem to be sort of positioning himself for 2024. And, you know, there's a lot of intrigue around the sort of the elbowing that is going on between Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo, with potentially Nikki Haley coming in there as well. I don't know, you know, whether if Trump leaves the scene next January or he leaves in January 2025, it is really interesting to see that already the big players are kind of putting themselves into position.
I'm going off format a little bit because there are relevant questions in the Q&A box. But one is that it seems that there are fewer American foreign correspondents working abroad and fewer U.S. media news bureaus overseas these days. Is this the case, and what effect is it having?
It is very much the case, especially because the budgets of news organizations have been strained so badly. I mean, there are a few papers like mine, the Washington Post and the New York Times, that are in great shape financially, but just about every other news organization has really seen themselves. The Post, by the way, is opening new bureaus overseas these days, but every other organization, it feels like, has had to pull back. And there are two trends that are going on. First, the mainstream, you know, long-standing permanent bureaus are disappearing, but you also have a lot of journalists overseas who are are there as freelancers. And in some cases, without the sort of infrastructure around them, sometimes they're not all that experienced, which is why you see a number of incidents where they tend to, get into some kind of trouble or other.
And another aspect of this is that the news that Americans are interested in is less about what's happening overseas. They're really focused on President Trump. And so news organizations are building up their staffs covering the White House. And they don't have the staff they used to have covering Afghanistan and Iraq and places in conflict.
Here's an interesting question. What questions related to foreign policy would you like to hear in the upcoming presidential and vice presidential debates?
Well, I'd like the questioners to try to pin down both candidates on this issue of American involvement abroad. That's a slippery question. Vice President Biden has tried to explain his views on that to some extent, saying he wants to end the endless wars and yet leave some troops in place. He doesn't want to completely abandon the field. So I think they ought to bore in on that one.
Okay, several serious journalists call Mike Pompeo the worst Secretary of State in modern U.S. history. Any thoughts? I've actually read a couple of columns with that as a title.
Yes.
Yes. One of Karen's editors, Jackson Deal, is among those, and I think there's good reason to build that argument. I mean, there's been an incredible downsizing of the State Department that Pompeo has presided over. He came in talking about restoring the department's swagger, but morale is now as low as it's been in quite a while. The number of applicants to the Foreign Service is now around 10,000 compared to a peak of about 30,000 in 2003. So the place has been seriously damaged. Rick Grinnell, who's one of President Trump's favorite diplomats, recently wrote a piece saying that there ought to be fewer career ambassadors and there ought to be more political ambassadors, including rich donors to presidential campaigns, to better reflect the desires of the person in the White House. And Grinnell's argument is there ought to be fewer people with language skills in U.S. embassies because that kind of talent is simply not needed.
I think that goes to a larger issue with this administration too, which is the disregard for expertise, almost the suspicion of expertise, the fear of the so-called deep state. I mean, they have really turned in many cases, and not just at the State Department, but just about every major federal agency. People, public servants who have devoted their careers to learning their subject matter are suddenly finding themselves portrayed as almost the enemy by the administration. I mean, you see that not only in foreign policy, but you see it in the Justice Department. You see it in dealing with the coronavirus. It just seems to be the ethos.
Well, do you think the State Department can regain its leadership role and influence? Something some people call swagger, in a post-Trump administration, or has diplomacy been changed forever?
Well, the decline of the State Department goes back a long way, and Bill Burns, who was Deputy Secretary of State and has standing on this issue, doesn't trace it entirely to the Trump administration, but it's gone on. I guess really since the end of the Soviet Union, the numbers have been gradually shrinking. If Vice President Biden wins, he's committed to rebuilding the diplomatic corps, but it's going to take a while. I mean, the general view is that it may take a generation to get it back, to bring back the kind of institutional understanding that it once had. So it's a long process, and there'll be a lot of other urgent American needs that will be competing with money that needs to go for diplomacy.
With the president taking up almost all of the oxygen, including on foreign policy, how do journalists covering foreign policy issues get to know what policies are being changed? Any sub rosa or below the radar changes? You mentioned limited access, which seems to be a hallmark of this administration. How do reporters deal with this and still get out important news and developments?
Well, reporters are still being pretty effective, in my opinion, in getting to the news. There are still a lot of people they can talk to. It's harder, but it can still be done. They can still watch what goes on. There are still, public documents they can scan. All the usual journalistic techniques are still available. And I think we've seen a flood of disclosures of all kinds during the Trump years, and that's still doable.
The policy making itself has changed so much in the Trump era. There was a long time there where the State Department and the Pentagon had both just essentially abandoned daily briefings for reporters. In fact, the White House went nearly a year without one. And one reason is that these departments know that you send somebody out to state your policy on any given issue, and it could be overturned at any moment by a presidential tweet. So I just think too, and it's something that really struck me in researching my book and spending time in the Reagan Library and watching, you can go through these documents and see what policymaking looked like and the kinds of dialogues that were going on. I just don't think that those even exist anymore. At least not in areas that Trump is interested in.
Okay. Much is being said about foreign disinformation operations during our elections. Many of us have been actively engaged in spinning foreign media during overseas elections, so we are shocked. Oh, this questioner puts it in capitals, shocked to hear that this is happening. Have either of you fine reporters, yes you are, ever seen that you've been spun to factual incorrectness by foreign disinformation?
Yeah, I don't think they bother to spin us anymore. What they do is they will put something just right into Facebook. They will go out there and do it on social media. And we saw a lot of that in the 2016 campaign. For instance, one of the things that the Russian bots were doing were sending a lot of posts to African Americans portraying Hillary Clinton and her comments during the 1990s on crime, and they were sending them to African Americans with the specific goal of sort of depressing the vote, which actually happened in a few key areas. So I do think that they have tools now that they can get their disinformation out that don't involve them having to persuade a journalist.
Okay, since so much foreign news coverage is based on bureaus in specific locations, how can the media improve their coverage of issues which cross borders and regions, including pandemics, migration, and now, of course, climate change? And the questioner said he is writing this question from the smoke-filled atmosphere of the Pacific Northwest.
Oh my gosh, and the president will be out on the West Coast today, so that he will probably be making some news in that regard. I do think that we bring a lot of resources. I think that you know, we don't cover pandemics out of the bureaus. We have a gigantic staff here in Washington of health reporters, of some of our diplomatic reporters, people covering the White House. Sort of, we have the ability to bring a lot of resources to it. And we also have the ability to tell stories in different ways, to tell it with data, to tell it with video, that just didn't exist even a few years ago.
We have many questions on this topic, and I suggest we get back to them later in the program. But let me ask, Paul, can you talk about your book?
Okay.
Yeah. My
book, which came out last November, is about a kind of special subcategory of American ambassadors, a group of career folks who were sent repeatedly to capitals in the greater Middle East during the George W. Bush and Obama years. These were the conflict zones: Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, Libya. And the people that I wrote about, the four ambassadors, were people that your viewers all know: Ryan Crocker, Ann Patterson, Robert Ford, and Chris Stevens. Unlike most ambassadors, they got to capitals where everything was in chaos, and the U.S. dialogue with these countries was not pretty much set, as is usually the case. These people had to go in and figure out what the U.S. role there should be and what they should do, and they ended up having very broad involvement in what happened in their host nations. They would help set up governments. They would broker deals between the important political blocs. In some cases, they even got involved in directing military and counterterrorism operations. So they were an unusually influential group of ambassadors.
I'm going to ask my own question. The ambassadors you talk about had an unusual amount of latitude in today's world. With the Trump administration and control that seems to be so much centered in the White House, are there ambassadors who have a similar latitude now?
Yes, I think there are. Well, we're obviously less involved in conflict zones, so there are not circumstances as there were in quite as they were in Afghanistan and Iraq in those days. But in many parts of the world, the White House is not paying close attention, and there are still ambassadors who are playing big and important roles in guiding bilateral relations.
I'm scrolling down to see if there are questions on the book. I don't see them, so let's quickly move on and give Karen a few minutes to talk about the book that's in the works, and then we can go back to whatever everybody wants to talk about.
So I'm writing a biography of Nancy Reagan. Simon & Schuster came to me shortly after her death and said that they were interested in a big biography of her. And, you know, honestly, I mean, I got the sense that she had sort of exercised her influence in a way no other first lady had. But I was surprised at how much in this book I would end up writing about foreign policy. In fact, and I'm now into the throes of the final editing, but my opening scene is in February 1983. George Shultz, who is 7 months into the job as Secretary of State, everybody's snowed in a blizzard, and Nancy Reagan invites him and his wife over for a private dinner at the White House. And he had just gotten back from China. And as he told the story to me, that both Reagans just started peppering him with questions about the Chinese leaders. You know, what are they like? Do they have a bottom line? Do they have a sense of humor? And then they move on to the Soviet Union. And that's the point at which George Shultz says it dawned on him that this president has never met a big-time communist leader and that he is dying to. And as the evening progresses, Shultz begins to realize a lot of other things about Ronald Reagan that he didn't realize. You know, how eager he is to engage with the Soviet Union. Now, don't forget, this is a president who had all this anti-communist rhetoric, whose administration, with the exception of a few people like Shultz, was really populated by hardliners. But then Shultz suddenly realized that this is the whole reason that Nancy Reagan has set up this dinner, that she wants him to understand something very fundamental about her husband, which is his desire to engage. And that the other thing Shultz realizes that evening is that he's found himself a very important ally in Nancy Reagan. Among other things, I trace in the book her role in the fact that Ronald Reagan went through 6 national security advisors. Several of them were dispatched because of her. So she really, you know, she watched his back. She had, in some ways, a more of a devotion to his place in history, I think, even than he did. But it's been just a fascinating project. And so I'm hoping that people will not only get new insights into her, but also perhaps look at the Reagan administration from a bit of a different vantage point as well.
Oh, thank you. I'm going back to the questions, and so we're going to be all over the map here, but that's fine. As you know, we're a bunch of public diplomacists, and many of us have been press attachés. And one such person said, in repeated roles as press attaché for almost 40 years, I noted a significant change in and about the mid to late 90s. When I started out, foreign correspondents from major American media were given license and trust to determine what the significant stories, news angles were, and how to produce them. Around 25 years ago, it suddenly became the New York, DC bureaus that would greenlight proposed stories or not, based on marketability of an angle or a storyline. Your thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, though, that sort of went in and out. I mean, a lot of the correspondents who were over covering Vietnam during the Vietnam War would complain that their reporting was getting lost between what I spent 14 years at Time magazine, and certainly people back in, I was not there in the 60s, but the people who were covering the war kind of were feeling constrained by Henry Luce and his views of foreign policy. But I do think that part of this is about the era that the financial constraints really start to hit our business, that the internet begins to break our business model. And so a part of that is resources. You know, what do people want to read? What can you sell? Now with the internet, our editors are watching every single story, not only who's reading the story at any given moment. I have an app on my phone that I can tell you right now how many people are on every single story in the Washington Post. But I can also tell you how many seconds they are spending reading that story, what they were reading before they decided to go to that story, what they go to after that. It's really, I do think that something is lost in making ourselves as, slavish to the kind of consumer tastes that we can now measure in ways that we couldn't before.
Okay, as journalists, could you suggest to foreign diplomats assigned to Washington how they can better assist journalists covering international news or foreign events?
The answer is to talk more, to explain more. Journalists are always eager to listen to knowledgeable people about their countries. And many of the embassies around the city do a lot of that, talk a lot, usually off the record or on background. But I think that's really the best. That's what the smart money says is the best way to get good coverage, is to explain it to the journalists. It works for many of the European embassies in particular, I think. The embassies from, a lot of the countries in the Middle East ought to be doing more talking. It would be to their benefit.
You talked about foreign policy in the Trump campaign and its transactional nature. Can you say a little bit more about the role of foreign policy as a topic as addressed by the Biden campaign and perhaps its impact internationally?
Well, certainly Vice President Biden, talks a fair amount about how he wants to restore some of the relationships, the international relationships that have been frayed in the Trump era. But I do think that there's not a lot of specificity at this point to it.
It's a difficult issue for the Democrats generally because they want to talk about our international alliances and our international obligations, but they don't want to leave the impression that they in any way support a continuation of our losing wars overseas. And so Biden is going to have to finesse that one.
Well, if Biden is elected, how long will it take to repair relations with our traditional allies, Europe, NATO, and so on? And I'll add to that, repair our public diplomacy.
Yeah. Well, I think some countries have been holding their breath, hoping that, the previous order will be restored. And I think that it can be restored. I think a lot of nations would be delighted to have something of the old ways return, but there's been damage done, and a lot of the American diplomats who are involved say that it's going to take a while to rebuild trust. And now, because of the Trump era, there will always be doubts in the minds of foreign leaders about the continuity of American policy. After seeing what Trump did, they're going to wonder if it can happen again.
We have a couple of questions from the chat box that I wanted to make sure that we could get to. Again, for our wonderful attendees, if you could please address your questions to the Q&A, but there are a few great ones I wanted to make sure that we could bring to Paul and Karen. So from Ambassador Carlson, there's a question. Years ago in the 1980s, the State Department press briefing was attended and enlivened by a bevy of foreign correspondents from the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, reporters who covered America and American foreign policy. They often brought out issues and questions that the US journalists had missed. Do foreign reporters still wander the halls of the department and pester the spokesperson with difficult and unexpected questions? If not, why not?
There's still a lot of demand from foreign reporters, and they're still there and present. Sometimes their questions are so specific that they're of less value internationally. They're about things that are very specific in their home countries, but they're there. They've had a harder time getting access because everybody has. But if the doors were reopened, they would gladly come back in.
I covered the White House in the late 90s, and it became sort of a running joke during Bill Clinton's impeachment, which of course was just, all about an investigation of all sorts of salacious things, that the president would come out and sort of give the networks a question or two, and then he'd go straight to the foreign reporters in the back of the room and start, answering questions about Zimbabwe or something.
And somewhat in that similar vein, talking about chaos and chaotic instances, I know, Paul, in your book, you chose I am wondering, how did you choose this topic of your book? What does it show about how these category of ambassadors, how did they continue to do their jobs during the chaotic war years in the greater Middle East?
Well, I chose the topic because I covered the State Department for a very long time, and I noticed from the beginning of the time I was there that whenever there was some new crisis engulfing a region, and usually it was the Middle East, the management at the State Department would return again and again to a same kind of small cast of characters who they had the most confidence in. And these people were moved around from place to place. Ryan Crocker was ambassador to 6 countries. Ann Patterson had a series of different ambassadorial and management posts, and they would keep coming up again and again. And I thought to myself, these people really see it all from the inside, and if I can interview them, I think I can really understand what went on and what the ground truth is about what's been happening in some of these places.
And speaking of books, we have another question in the chat box. Karen, did you find that Nancy Reagan was a source for background or off-the-record information about foreign affairs decisions and policy? Can you speak more to her confidants in the press corps?
Certainly, yeah. Well, she was very much of a source for reporters and columnists. In fact, she was so very, very close to George Will that people would often almost think they could hear her voice in George Will's column. And there was a lot of tension between her and the Bushes. So very often when George Will would write something extremely critical of the vice president, people would assume they were listening to Nancy Reagan. But she would also really, there were a couple of national security advisors that she just really felt were too hardline for what she believed her husband's presidency should be about. And so there were a lot of leaks during Iran-Contra. There were also a lot of leaks that came out of the First Lady's office and the First Lady herself as she was trying to get her husband to fire the White House Chief of Staff, Don Regan. In fact, one little story, Chris Wallace was then, who's now at Fox, was then with NBC. And he's leaving the White House one day, and one of the First Lady's best friends comes over to him and tells him that the White House Chief of Staff, Don Regan, has hung up on the First Lady. He slammed down the phone on her. So, of course, Chris that night, this is a big, big news in NBC News. And it turns out that the Reagans would watch NBC News every night sitting there with their TV trays, so that when Chris Wallace reports this incredibly rude thing the Chief of Staff has done to the First Lady, Ronald Reagan turns to his wife and says, "Did that really happen?" And Reagan was gone pretty soon after that. So she was pretty shrewd in her, rather than telling her husband herself, she let the television tell him.
On that note, I'll ask one more question and turn it back over to Joel. There is one in the Q&A that I think would be a fantastic follow-up to that question. It's from Dr. Elizabeth Colton. She asks, from her own coverage of heads of state and their wives, or husband in the case of Margaret Thatcher, her sense is that Nancy Reagan, like many such wives, got some negative coverage over the years. What were some examples you found that turned out to be unfair or even false about Nancy Reagan? And was there any way that she could combat such false or negative coverage other than through historical research like yours? Things were definitely different just then.
It was really funny. She watched her husband's image like a hawk. I mean, she watched his back. But she did some pretty kind of, she was pretty clueless about managing her own for quite a while. So, you know, they come into office in 1981, they're in the middle of a recession. She buys $200,000 with private donations, $200,000 worth of china, and she's borrowing designer. These are all things that she ultimately realized were big mistakes on her part. But so she did suffer for the first 5 or 6 years. She suffered from people seeing her as a shallow sort of dilettante fashionista. And then after Iran-Contra, where it's very clear that she has been in charge of the rescue effort, that she has gotten the chief of staff fired, all of a sudden the people who liked their first ladies in a little more traditional role were suddenly, I believe William Safire at one point referred to her as an incipient Edith Wilson running the country secretly in her husband's stead. So she went from people thinking she was shallow to people thinking she was actually running the place. I think neither of those things were entirely true, but she was not very good at managing her own image.
Okay, we have someone here who wants to know what you know about the president's tweets. Is it true that they're unfiltered missives from his phone, or is there anyone reviewing them before they're disseminated?
It's very clear that these are coming directly from his phone. The ones that are not are the ones where the grammar and capitalization is a little bit more normal. But yes, these are definitely coming through his own phone. And by the way, there are some real security issues about this. Barack Obama was the first president who was allowed to have an iPhone. And Greg Craig, who was then the White House counsel, told him, look, Mr. President, we're going to let you have this, and you're going to be able to email, but you're going to have a list of fewer than 20 people that you are allowed to communicate with on this phone. And you also need to realize that every single thing that you send from this phone will someday be reviewed by the National Archives and may ultimately, you may think it's private, but the National Archives, the archivist, may make it public. So I'm really sort of surprised at the, license that the president seems to have with his phone. And, again, a lot of conversations, very sensitive conversations on phones that are, phone systems that are not all that secure.
Okay, I'd like to share with you a comment that I share, having just read your book, Paul. I have read, this is a colleague of mine who said, I have read Paul's fine book and have worked with all 4 of the ambassadors he discussed. I believe his narrative was both interesting and accurate.
Thank you. That's a wonderful compliment.
How is
one from Bruce Gregory also in that same vein, Joel.
Oh,
He has a question for Paul, saying 2 of your 4 ambassadors, Robert Ford and Chris Stevens, were exceptionally skilled in their uses of social media. So what conclusions did you draw in the process of writing your book as to how these skills enhanced or created challenges for their diplomacy?
Well, in the case of Robert Ford in particular, when he was in Syria in 2011, say, this was all pretty new territory. And the State Department gave him some leeway to experiment with it, but he was kind of making it up as he went along. It was interesting. His goal was really to reach out to ordinary Syrians through social media to try to get their reactions. And he thought that by carrying on a kind of a frank, flowing discussion with them, he might be able to convince some of them of the American viewpoint on all this. And he received a flood of people who were hostile to the US. Some of them were kind of government stooges. Others were kind of Syrians who simply feared what would happen if there were a revolution. And it went back and forth. It was a great free-flowing discussion. And Ford discovered that if he carried on his conversations in Arabic, no one back at headquarters in Washington could really even figure out what he was saying. And so it gave him an unusual amount of latitude.
let me jump on that. Ambassadors increasingly are having to use social media, are finding that they're having to use social media to reach people they want to reach. Does this mean that the tether to Washington could be less tight?
Well, I mean, I don't think Washington would like that. As you know, the State Department is a place where, partly because they're under congressional scrutiny and White House scrutiny, they really don't like, they want to have certain limits on the dialogue that's going back and forth. But there certainly is an opportunity, an unusual opportunity for American diplomats in the field to communicate as they see fit to the public.
I think Rick Grinnell is in his job now because he was so active on social media. I mean, my first recollection of my first acquaintance with him, he was basically a Twitter troll. And, he is out there just really engaging in combat on Twitter constantly, which is sort of unusual for somebody in his position.
Okay, let's shift gears. How is the media covering the Russian disinformation efforts, and what ways can it inform the American public as a way of bringing reality back? We know that the Russians are trying the same themes, including trying to suppress the African American vote again.
There's really a dilemma for those of us in the media, and by calling this stuff out, you also elevate it. But I have, in fact, this week I have asked an outfit called Signal Labs to give me an analysis of the social media conversation about Kamala Harris, because it was so amazing to see the birthers come after her immediately. There's a lot of stuff I've come across that is racist and sexist. And so they're going to try and give me some sort of quantitative measure of this. But like I said, for us, it's a dilemma. On the one hand, you want to call it out when you see it, but on the other hand, you're giving it more distribution by doing that.
And there's a question also of how much kind of electoral impact these disclosures have. I mean, those of us in the media follow it really closely, but I wonder how much impact it will have in changing Russian behavior or in changing the American public's view of this. A lot of American voters who are, support the president, I'm not sure their opinions are going to be shifted much by more disclosures on this subject.
But they're very sophisticated and they're very targeted in the ways they do this. They can do rifle shots at what specific population or segment they want to hit.
Okay, on a personal level, how do you engage with Americans you meet who have distorted understandings of U.S. foreign policies and levels of foreign assistance, based either on a simple lack of knowledge or the impact of misinformation and disinformation?
Wow, that's an enormous job, because
it is.
Most of the public thinks that we're spending, hundreds of billions of dollars on foreign aid, and they don't really understand the scale of things. They think that we're, being mistreated by all our allies, and that's one reason why President Trump has a certain amount of support for complaining about NATO and other alliances. So you have to kind of start from the beginning. But I think the whole Trump era shows the importance of kind of explaining to the public how the government works and what the basics are.
Okay, a question for Karen. As you probably know, USIA Director Charlie Wick is a legendary figure in our professional careers. Do you get into the Wick's relationship with the Reagans?
Quite a bit, in fact. And one of the great sources for my book was their son, Doug Wick, who is an Academy Award-winning movie producer. He was the producer of Gladiator. He won Best Picture for that. So yes, this friendship another role that she really played was sort of building the scaffolding around his career. It was really her friendship with Mary Jane Wick that brings in Charles, and Charles raises a whole lot of money for that 1980 presidential campaign.
Okay.
We do have another question.
Go ahead.
Sure thing. This one is from Willem Post, who is an IVLP alumnus and exchange alumni. And he asks, for us Western Europeans, US foreign policy is the most important element of US presidential campaigns. What do you expect from a President Biden concerning his foreign policy versus Europe? Will he also be first and for all a Pacific president? Will we get a new Biden doctrine?
Yes. Well, Vice President Biden's been fairly clear on what his intentions are. And Tony Blinken, who was his Deputy Secretary of State, is one of his top advisors. And you can go on the Biden website and find out a lot of his plans. He wants to restore the alliances. I think he'll go to Europe immediately, I would expect, and tell the Western Europeans who are the continental Western Europeans who have been feeling alienated that the old times are back. I think that whoever is president, difficult times will continue with the Chinese. I think there's been a basic reorientation of American attitudes about dealing with China, and so I expect that relationship will continue to be rocky.
Paul, can you discuss your view of Ambassador Bill Burns' recent articles on the future of U.S. foreign policy, restoration, retreat, or reinvention? Those may not be exactly the terms he uses, but the idea is, how does America adjust to the future?
Yes, well, Bill Burns knows the subject better than anybody. I interviewed him for my book, and I quoted him in my book, and he's kind of, in my view, kind of the baseline for sensible thinking about the diplomatic corps. He thinks it's going to take a long time to restore the diplomatic corps to what it was. He thinks it's worth spending the money that it's going to take. So he's the guy to go to. He's writing regularly. I guess it's in the Atlantic on the subject, and I think his advice should be listened to.
Okay, assuming a Biden administration next January, do you have any thoughts on how public diplomacy can be rebuilt, considering the damage and loss of public diplomacy officers? The questioner feels that the PA part of that, public affairs, can be rebuilt fairly easily since it's always been based primarily on political appointees. But PD may be more complicated. Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's again this whole process of restoring confidence in the continuity of American policy, and that confidence has been lost. A lot of countries, a lot of our longtime friends are wondering which way it's going to go. I mean, if President Trump loses, there'll still be a Trump as part of the Republican Party. It may continue to dominate the Republican Party, and so foreign governments are going to continue to have doubts about how much trust they can put in what the current American policy is. It's going to be a long process.
Okay, both of you have interacted with lots of embassies here in Washington over the years. Which embassies do you feel have been most effective in the use of public diplomacy, use of media, culture, education to influence Americans?
Well, they have a lot going for them because a lot of our major allies have a great understanding, have great contacts with the American public and the American press, and have a lot of leverage. You know, the Israelis believe in conversation, and they do it skillfully with everybody. The major European governments, the French, the British, to a lesser extent, the Germans. I think the Germans under Merkel have been, I think, more cautious about reaching out, and I think they. My advice to them would be to try to, especially in this period now, which is where Americans have, some Americans have become kind of anti-German. I think the Germans need to step up their game on public diplomacy. There's my advice.
Yeah. Katie, there is apparently a question in the chat. You're monitoring the chat box.
Yes, indeed. There's a great question that asks about a very powerful method of U.S. public diplomacy, and that would be U.S. international broadcasting. The question here is, any thought on whether Biden might address the problems that have arisen with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, what has happened just at Voice of America is, you know, appalling. And, you know, I think Amanda Bennett was doing a terrific job there. And I can only assume that, yes, they will be, these are things I think that can be fixed pretty quickly.
Yeah, there's been a long agreement that these international these organizations that aim at international audiences ought to have a certain amount of independence, and I think probably Biden would want to restore that. That's been a tradition that's been embraced by Republican and Democratic presidents in the past.
And now, thinking on the flip side, another question in our chat box is from Ambassador Greta Morris, who asks, how does the foreign media view President Trump's handling of COVID-19, as well as any thoughts from both of you on the foreign view of Bob Woodward's new book?
Yeah.
On the issue of American handling of it, I think that well, there's a lot of criticism, but on the other hand, a lot of foreign governments have also been criticized for their handling of COVID as well. I mean, the British government has, you know, the Swedish government. There have been a lot of countries that have slipped. Italy, Spain, I think. So it's not. You know, there's some criticism to go around, but the U.S., which has 5% of the world's population and 20% of the cases, comes in, I think, especially hard, and that's probably justifiably so.
I had a conversation not too long ago with an ambassador from a Western European country too, who said that what was striking to him was how politicized health measures had become here. That he said in his country, you know, everybody sort of accepted what made sense to bring the spread under control, and that something like putting on a mask would not have been seen as a sign of what political party you belong to.
Although there is now some, you know, there is some resistance to COVID measures in other countries too. I mean, in Germany, in England, there are a lot of places where businesses are unhappy at the restrictions. So this phenomenon isn't uniquely American.
Okay, Katie, do you have any more questions in the chat box?
Not that haven't already been discussed, but I do see there are some great ones in the question and answer box, that's for sure.
Well, I have one more here.
Mm-hmm.
Let's consider this a last question. The damage done to the U.S. image abroad under this administration also impacts our ability to attract international students, particularly those who pursue critical fields in the sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Assuming a Biden presidency, we're doing a lot of assuming of a Biden presidency today.
Yeah, I remember we did that 4 years ago too, so it's assume nothing.
how long might it take to restore educational exchange and student visa funding and policies that facilitate educational exchange? And this is from the president, John Lucas, the president of the International Student Exchange Program.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of demand for foreign students from Americans' leading universities. So I think there would be political pressure to try to restore the old system as soon as possible. The colleges really want that money.
Do you have any lasting thoughts before we close?
Any final thoughts?
Yeah.
Well, my book's coming out in paperback in October, so I want to put a plug in for that.
I can also put a plug in for the ebook version, which is the one I read.
Yeah, that's good too.
Paul and Karen, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful session. And we look forward to engaging with you again sometime in the future.
Thank you very much. It's been delightful. And you West Coasters, good luck with everything that's going on out there.
Oh, yes. And we do have people on the West Coast on this call, on this session. And to everyone, join us on Monday, October 5th, for a session on how 3 foreign correspondents see the 2020 US presidential election. Ed Luce of the Financial Times, Mwamoyo, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing that name, Mwamoyo Hamza of VOA Swahili Service, and Cristobal Vasquez of Colombia will discuss what most interests their respective audiences. So please join us on October 5, same place, same time. Thank you very much. Until then, see you.